Does the prospect of assassination worry you at all, or do you ignore that concern?
Pardon?
Does the possibility of an attack on you, does that worry you?
No, I am not afraid. I am not afraid. Sorry. I am not afraid of this action.
Even when the greatest power on earth, the United States, has, or many of its senior officials have declared that they would like to see you finished.
They love me, all my people with me. They love me all.
But if they do love
They will die to protect me, my people. No.
It's October 2011. Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan leader who once styled himself as the King of Kings of Africa, is dead.
Today, the government of Libya announced the death of Muammar Gaddafi. This marks the end of a long and painful chapter for the people of Libya, who now have the opportunity to determine their own destiny in a new and democratic Libya.
Many believe that Gaddafi's death was not just the result of a popular uprising, but a deliberate regime change orchestrated by Western powers, especially the United States. But why? Gaddafi was no stranger to controversy. For over 40 years, he ruled Libya with an iron fist, amassing immense wealth and power. Behind his flamboyant outfits and erratic speeches, he defied Western influence at every turn. They viewed him as a pariah, but domestically, he oversaw sweeping reforms like free healthcare and education.
Libya is a arid country, but they have rich semi-arid conditions on the north coast where most of the population is, and they have under the Sahara, there are tremendous deposits of fossil water that go back to the Pleistocene when the conditions were very different than currently, and they've tapped this amount of water and they're bringing massive amounts of water to the north coast. And it's one of the largest civil engineering projects in the history of the world, perhaps, where they've got 4-meter in diameter pipeline that's laid under the, all steel reinforced, laid under the desert, and they're bringing the water to the north where they could make that land bloom like the Imperial Valley and also serve industrial and other needs. They're going to be moving 4 million cubic meters of water a day up to that northern coastline.
President Ronald Reagan famously called him the mad dog of the Middle East after a string of incidents. In 1981, Washington announced that a Libyan hit team had been intercepted while trying to assassinate President Reagan, who stated to the media that they had evidence. However, after investigations, the whole thing was termed a complete fabrication. 5 years later, Libya's intelligence services were blamed for the 1986 bombing of a Berlin nightclub frequented by American soldiers. The U.S. responded with airstrikes on Tripoli and Benghazi, killing his daughter Hannah, further escalating tensions between Libya and the West.
My fellow Americans, at 7 o'clock this evening, Eastern Time, air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities. The attacks were concentrated and carefully targeted to minimize casualties among the Libyan people, with whom we have no quarrel. On April 5th, in West Berlin, a terrorist bomb exploded in a nightclub frequented by American servicemen. Sergeant Kenneth Ford and a young Turkish woman were killed, and 230 others were wounded, among them some 50 American military personnel.
And then there was Lockerbie, the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, which killed 270 people and blamed on Libyan agents. For years, Libya was under international sanctions and Gaddafi was seen as a global outcast. Later, Gaddafi sought to rehabilitate his image, particularly after the September 11th terrorist attacks. In 2003, his government accepted responsibility for Lockerbie and agreed to compensate the victims, earning him some degree of favor with Western leaders.
We will try to arrange that. I am very pleased to welcome Minister Gaddafi here to the State Department. We deeply value the relationship between the United States and Libya. We have many opportunities to deepen and broaden our cooperation, and I'm very much looking forward to building on this relationship. So, Mr. Minister, welcome so much here.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're delighted you're here.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
The ambassador from Libya says.
To further boost the regime's repentance, reports stated that Libya hired the U.S.-based Monitor Group to undertake a public relations cleansing campaign. With good press in the Western media now, Libya was ripe for an arms deal. In 2009, approximately $500 million worth of British, French, German, and Italian arms were believed to have been shipped. As late as November 2010, just weeks before the Arab Spring began, more than 50 British companies attended a Libyan arms fair at an airport in Tripoli. The Libyans were now a favored regime. Indeed, when Libyan regime offices were raided in 2011, a letter was found from Tony Blair addressed to Gaddafi. Dated 2007, it thanked Gaddafi for his excellent cooperation, after beginning with Dear Muammar and ending with Best wishes yours ever, Tony. So, how did we go from rapprochement to regime change in less than a decade? To understand why many believe the U.S. played a crucial role in Gaddafi's death, we need to look at the events leading up to the Libyan revolution and, more importantly, Gaddafi's growing challenge to Western financial interests. In early 2011, the Arab Spring swept across North Africa and the Middle East, toppling dictators in Tunisia and Egypt. When the protests began in Libya, Gaddafi's response was swift and brutal. His military crushed demonstrations with overwhelming force. The crackdown sparked international outrage, and soon NATO joined in, launching airstrikes under the guise of protecting civilians. Officially, the mission was to enforce a no-fly zone and protect civilians from Gaddafi's forces. But it quickly evolved into a de facto regime change operation.
Time is working against Gaddafi, and he must step down from power and leave Libya to the Libyan people.
NATO forces bombed Gaddafi's compounds, military installations, and infrastructure. The strikes were not just defensive. They systematically weakened Gaddafi's ability to govern, tipping the scales in favor of the rebels. One of the most compelling reasons people believe the U.S. had a hand in his death revolves around his ambitious financial plans. Gaddafi was working to create a new pan-African currency backed by gold. Although simple, the idea was revolutionary. African nations would stop relying on the US dollar or euro for trade and instead use this new currency, which would be backed by Libya's vast gold reserves. At the time, Libya held over 140 tons of gold, making Gaddafi's vision a credible threat to the established global financial order. Gaddafi had always been a champion of pan-Africanism, and he didn't just talk the talk. He put his money where his mouth was. He pumped billions into African development projects, financed liberation movements across the continent, and advocated for the United States of Africa, a political and economic union of African nations. But his plan was a direct threat to Western economic interests. In 2016, leaked emails from then-Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's private server added fuel to these suspicions. One email, in particular, referenced Gaddafi's gold reserves and his push for a pan-African currency. It read, Gaddafi's plan to create a gold-backed African currency threatens the US and European financial systems. Gaddafi opened up key parts of the Libyan economy to foreign investment. However, what was alarming for the Western governments was his apparent free-for-all approach to the investment opportunities, granting oil concessions to Chinese, Indian, Japanese, and Russian companies. China was winning multi-billion-dollar contracts in construction and infrastructure projects. In 2008, Russia agreed to forgive a $4.5 billion of Soviet-era debt in exchange for the first pick of various new Libyan development contracts, ruffling U.S. feathers even more. Washington was becoming frustrated, complaining of lukewarm embrace of U.S. corporate interests. For example, it was reported that ExxonMobil was strong-armed into a new oil-sharing agreement that gave it much less favorable terms, calling for $5 billion in upfront payments to the Libyan government. By 2009, things seemed to be getting even worse with Gaddafi threatening to renationalize Libyan oil. European companies were not left behind. Italy complained that any hopes of winning development contracts seemed to hang on its government's paying $200 million a year for 25 years as compensation for colonial injustices. To add salt to injury, Gaddafi supported the Kremlin's views on NATO expansionism in Georgia and Ukraine. Along with Nigeria, he publicly voiced his opposition to the expansion of the Stuttgart-based U.S. Africa Command Base to the African continent. To the West, this wasn't just about Gaddafi being a brutal dictator. It was about power, control, and money. He needed to be contained. When NATO's airstrikes hit his convoy in Sirte, many saw it as the final blow. The rebels captured and killed him, but the precision with which NATO tracked and targeted Gaddafi's movements raised eyebrows. Analysts believe that this was a highly coordinated operation. NATO's intelligence capabilities far exceeded that of the Libyan rebels. It's not far-fetched to suggest that they knew exactly where Gaddafi was and made sure he couldn't escape. Gaddafi's death was brutal, and the images of his bloody corpse being paraded through the streets were broadcast around the world. But while many celebrated the fall of a dictator, others questioned the legality of NATO's intervention. Did NATO overstep its mandate? Was this really about protecting civilians? Or was it about eliminating a leader who had become inconvenient? In the years since Gaddafi's death, Libya has descended into chaos. The country has been wrecked by civil war, tribal conflicts, and the rise of extremist groups. For many Libyans, the hope of freedom and democracy has been replaced by despair and lawlessness.
أنا في طيحتي جاء صب علي واحد شرطي جاء هو من الثوار جاء وشاد في يد المسدس داك رجلي من هنا كراكرية أنتم تبقوا معمر وأنتم مساعدين معمر يا عبيد يا كلاب نموتوا كمات معمر أنتم مكانكم مش هنا.
Gaddafi's death, instead of ushering in a new era, has left a power vacuum that no one has been able to fill. For Western powers, Libya's collapse is seen as collateral damage. But the question remains, did the U.S. and its allies orchestrate Gaddafi's death to protect their financial and geopolitical interests? The U.S. and NATO may have removed a dictator, but they also unleashed chaos. And for many, that chaos was the intended outcome. Gaddafi's Libya was one of the most prosperous countries in Africa. Its oil wealth gave it significant influence, and Gaddafi's pan-African vision threatened to undermine Western control. His removal allowed Western powers to reassert dominance over the region and its resources.